All right, we're clicking. Just respond. We've got a few people in listening mode. Welcome, everyone, to our continuing off-week meeting of the pacing subgroup so that we can continue to make progress in between the full tag meetings. This is being recorded. I sent around a tentative agenda, particularly to follow up on the discussion that was excellent to have Colin Smythe here last time. Thank you, TJ, for setting that up so that we could achieve more clarity or better understanding of what the Agency of Natural Resources is tallying for greenhouse gas emissions for the GWSA statute, because that is at least one of the starting points for us as we look at numbers, or at least targets and trends that we're seeking for the clean heat standard. So I wanted to, number one, ask if there are pressing issues that folks would like to make sure we cover in this 1 hour meeting today. I've got the continued discussion, clarified our near-term deliverables, any recommendations for at least options we'd like to make for the commission. Those would be the three, my hot topics. Anything else that people would like to make sure we cover today? Okay, well, if they come up, feel free to bring them up as we go. After thinking about it, were there any other questions or points that this group wanted to highlight after the discussion with Colin and the further exploration of the greenhouse gas emission numbers? I will share that my first impression was that they're moving targets, but not likely large enough ones. We're still just looking for, we can work with the moving targets, and that's built into what we're doing for the clean heat standard in having adjustments where appropriate. Just would like other people's thoughts on it. Looks like I want to make sure I'm calling the right ones. The 2025 numbers are likely to be, the actuals are likely to be quite different from what we are using as the starting point for those possible trajectories you were pulling out, TJ.
Yeah, just my takeaway in general is similar to yours, Michelle, just that the targets are moving a little bit. And so I think, but generally, we can kind of make some assumptions here and use some recent data, and then getting it exactly right is probably less important than setting up the structure and the process, because those are moving a little bit. And so we shouldn't worry so much about, if we set the target 2/100ths of a million metric ton off, then probably not that big of a deal in the long run. And probably more important for us to just kind of make a process decision and start to kind of tackle other things as well.
I'm seeing nodding heads. And did you catch enough of that, Emily? We're glad to see you.
No, sorry, but I don't feel the need to retread for me. I'll catch up.
Just seeking any additional feedback after the information that Colin shared at the last meeting. And while she's getting settled, I do want to thank you, Emily, for bringing up the Energy Action Network report a couple meetings back. It turns out that has been published, and there's some graphics in there that are nice references. and an alternate resource. People probably didn't get a chance to see it. I just found the electronic link this morning and sent it out. But for future reference, that is available.
If you were just asking for general feedback, I found that super helpful to hear from Colin and better understand. And it was particularly useful to hear that they do plan to use the fuel tax data going forward and are kind of working some of the kinks out of that. So that will kind of, I was just very glad to hear there wasn't going to be like this new data source that we would use and they wouldn't use or something like that. So
That's
there are a lot of
that's
other
an important point.
reconciliation still, but at least that's kind of in process. And he also flagged this non-road diesel issue that we need to pay attention to. And yeah, it was just really helpful.
And from that, for the data and the fact that Colin was saying they are planning to rely on the tax information, I'm not sure if Deirdre is monitoring or could potentially respond to this. I believe you had stated that the tax data has been collected. It's sorted by fuel type starting last summer. There were a few gaps, but it didn't sound like those were going to keep us from being able to use the data coming from the tax records. Is that still a fair interpretation?
So I think the aggregate fuel tax data is, which, already A&R has access to, is solid. I think the way that it's been reported to the commission at the first registration is going to be difficult to, I think there were some obligated entities that didn't report necessarily. And so we'll need to be mindful about how we use 2023 sales data, but we do have access to the tax data to cross-reference and check those numbers. So that's really the purpose of having that information available. But the only thing that I wanted to also, remind us of, Colin mentioning that there is a motivation to start using the fuel tax data in the RCI sector and inventory, but that it sounded like there wasn't a solution yet to how do you backtrack that to 1990 because there's not that data available. And it sounded like that was still being worked out. So I just wanted to remind us of that too, that it's not an easy transition to use the fuel tax data in that sector, is what my memory was.
That too is an important point.
So I kind of want to just make a proposal here to move us forward on this, in recognizing that what you just said, Deirdre, I think that's important to recognize going forward. But I think for setting like the first step of what the department's kind of pacing is just to get a GWSA pacing. What I was saying earlier, I think right now, at least initially, like we need to go, and getting it precise and accurate is a little less important than kind of getting in the ballpark and setting that trajectory. And so what I think we should do is take I'm going to propose this. I think this is what I think we should do, but is take the 2023 tax data and weather normalize it so that, it was a warm winter. We don't want to just have the effects of the weather kind of throw us off in terms of a trajectory and what people might have to do going forward. And then take so that's the amount of fuel, and we can project the amount of emissions according to GWSA counting with that data, and then draw a path to the calendar year 2029 target as identified by the greenhouse gas inventory. And I suggest the first path at least be a linear one, and then we could discuss, we could do it now or after, we could discuss whether it should be front loaded or back loaded. I think there's policy considerations both ways, but for the first line should just be a linear one. Front loading has the benefit of getting more emissions reductions sooner. There's like a time value to that. Backloading has the value of allowing the market to develop a little bit more and build understanding, but could create some big targets in the last year also. And so, so the proposal is for, and I think we can do this in the next week or so at the department for you all to review, if you agree, is to just have a one-pager explaining that process. And then we could even try and do it with to the extent we have the numbers, the tax data and weather normalization.
So let me restate what I think you said, TJ, just to make sure I understand it, because I remember at the last meeting, you were saying, well, maybe we should just use the target, like the GWSA target for 2024. So this is a revised proposal from that, now that we've learned a little bit more about the fuel data. So you're suggesting using the 2023 fuel data with the corrections for off-road fuels that Colin and is working on, and that the Clean Heat Standard seems to require, right? And also with weather normalization, 2023 being the most recent year for which we have fuels data. I thought at the last meeting you also expressed some concern about using 2023, like you thought there could already be influence, am I remembering that, of like the Clean Heat Standard, or it wasn't, I don't know. Do you have any?
Yeah, well, yes, and I can explain why I got over that, but I don't know if you can continue or you want me to do
Yeah,
that.
so no, so that is I guess that's my question. So I think I understand your proposal. I'm just noting that it is different in a couple of respects from what you were talking about last time. So I just wanted to note that, and which is totally fine. But I am curious to understand why you're not concerned about the 2023 data anymore.
Right. So I think it is, so I was concerned about the influence of how early action credits would play into it. And in terms of those credits being applied to, applied to the eventual target, and us either overcounting or undercounting going forward. But for this first initial step, I think I came to the realization that it's not an issue, because we're really just looking at what are the actual emissions in the state and what's our trajectory for GWSA emissions. Those early action credits will come in and be important as we think about like how to assign how many credits we need to require each obligated entity to procure. And so I think that it is not an issue for like this initial trajectory to get to, the pace of the target that we need to get to. Really, early action credits will just be, we'll have to make the obligations higher to account for these early action credits, but that's a later step.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. I think you're right that we're rolling it up at such a high level that we don't need to get into that type of influence. I know Colin, so you said the department could work on this. Colin said he was working on it too. Like he wouldn't be able to do the entire inventory for 2022 and 2023 anytime soon because of other sectors, but he probably could do like his best guess as an inventory compatible estimate for the thermal sector pretty quickly. So would you work with him to do that, to make sure that, because that is important to me, that we, to the extent possible, align with what we think A&R will have in their initial inventory for that year.
Right. Well, they won't have 2023 in the inventory. But in terms of the target itself, the 2029 calendar year target, they will. And if that has modified at all based on revisions that Colin's working on, then we would use that new target for sure. And yeah, we work pretty closely with A&R, so we can work with them. What I was proposing really is getting the I think that what's most
Oh, right,
important
yeah.
for the commission is getting the process, and if we have the numbers in this week, then that we can do that, and that would be helpful to illustrate it. But for this group anyway, having the process on paper to agree upon probably most important.
Yeah, that's a great point. Yeah, I was getting hung up with the actual numbers. I totally understand it's not going to actually be in the inventory, but he kind of made it. I felt like what he was saying was that he could basically calculate the 2022 and 23 values for the thermal sector. They're not going to appear in the inventory yet, but in 2 years, or when they do eventually appear in the inventory, he could help us have a number that is like about basically the same number, very close to what eventually appears in the inventory.
Yeah, I would love for him to just give us that number, and then we don't have to calculate it at all. And then it's the exact same.
Yeah, that's my preference as well.
Yeah.
But yeah, so with all of that said, I just sorry for all those clarifications and just understanding why your recommendation has shifted a little bit from last time. That makes sense to me, and I agree with that proposal. Like, right, that makes sense to me.
Thanks, Emily, and appreciate the proposal, TJ. Do any other folks have comments they'd like to make or questions, particularly about starting with 2023?
I'm in favor of that proposal.
Good to hear. And again, this gets us started. This gets us started. At this point, do we need to do anything formal to acknowledge and decide to proceed with that? We're not we're not in full tag mode at this point, so this.
Yeah, I think because the subgroups can't make decisions on behalf of the whole tag, as long as it's documented that this probably should go on a proposal from this group, written down so that it can be shared with the full tag when it makes sense.
Good.
It's a good thing to do.
Excellent.
Michelle, just to note that we have the draft agenda. We have time for you to meet again next Thursday during the tag meeting if you need it. But if you would rather use that time to, report back to this on your recommendations, at the end of the meeting, we should just touch base and decide the best use of the time for you, for this group.
Okay, so that would be breakout session or report to the full tag.
Yes, if you need more, if you want to use it as a breakout session, we have about 45 minutes set aside.
Good to know. Let's see how we're doing.
We'll try to get it to you all before that time, before next Thursday, so that can either review that then, or if people have comments on it beforehand, maybe we come to agreement offline if it all looks good, and then we can use that time in a breakout group as a planning our next move.
Seeing nods, that sounds good. So we're going to continue to utilize the greenhouse gas inventory. TJ and his colleagues are going to document for us how that could apply at this very first stage as an option for the commission. I think we can move on to what do we want to make as our top priorities for the next 2 to 3 weeks, knowing that there is also a full tag and commission discussion going on, or I should say tag leadership and commission discussion going on for near-term deliverables.
And I guess this is a question of if this is in scope of this group or not, but I guess after kind of that proposal just discussed, my mind next jumps to how those emissions reduction requirements basically for each year to hit requirements, how that then translates to obligation for each entity. So yeah, that's, I guess my question, is it this group that could then provide process for how that annual emissions reduction requirement is then translated into the obligation for obligated parties and or credit requirements?
And I like that you used the word process, because we all understand there are so many dependencies that are required to come up with actual numbers and algorithms there.
And I think there's a lot in the act on this, but Act 18, but yeah.
Yeah, I would support that as a next step for this group. Whether that means translating those emission targets to life cycle and then credits, or basically how those just generally how those limits at a process level, how do those limits get boiled down to credits that can then be distributed to obligated entities.
So in our in the comments we filed back in February, that was kind of the outline, and recognizing that there's a lot of detail to be worked out in those, and that, you know, more information could lead to a change in those. What we had suggested then is to take kind of the line that's drawn with the process that we'll get a memo for next week, right? That was step one. And then to use the registration data that details the amount of fuel stowed to assign each obligated party its proportional share of that obligation, of that target. Then we need to translate that into actual clean heat credit requirements. So we have like emissions requirements, but we need to translate that to credit requirements, that's where the difference in life cycle versus GHG inventory accounting comes in. It's the process that we'll need to think will take some time, and I'm not sure if we can do a whole lot until after the potential study is done.
I'm sorry, go ahead, Deirdre.
No, I was just curious how the potential study was factored into that reconciliation. I wasn't sure between
Yeah, so in my mind, the potential study is important because it creates a measure mix and an estimated measure mix, and we could either use that or something a little different if people don't agree with like the measure mix that's there, but it'll have like a optimized path for going forward that meets the requirements of low income. It makes the requirements of installed measures versus fuels, and then and the measure mix is important because those measures all have different life cycle values, And so using that, then we can say, okay, we need to get this many credits, clean heat value credits to meet the requirement, like life cycle credits. I'm not explaining this super clearly today. But that's what we can use to translate life cycle to actual GWSA emissions inventory impacts.
So TJ, you wouldn't, I guess in my mind jumps to, I don't even know if it's possible, but if tax data specifies, fuel sold rather than just translating that fuel to its life cycle emissions, or I guess what I'm trying to suggest is why not just do the life cycle translation from the actual fuel, the tax data, and or fuel dealer registration data, and why try to make it off of a fuel mix or a measure mix?
I think because there are some requirements for specific types of measures in the law, and because those life cycle emissions won't translate directly to GWSA reductions. So if, for instance, this is going to be a bad example, I'm going to use it anyway. If wood was determined to have a life cycle impact of 1-to-1, right? Like, I'm going to just use extremes, 1-to-1. So it doesn't really have a life cycle emissions reductions, but on the GWSA inventory, it actually has emissions reductions. Well, nobody's going to use wood in that scenario because they won't get a credit value for it. It was a bad example. This is like the inverse of the point I wanted to make, or biofuels could have a 50% reduction. Like every gallon of biofuels, you get basically credit for a half of a gallon because it's not like a 1-to-1 ratio. That could like encourage everybody to do biofuels or nobody to do biofuels, depending on how it relates to the inventory. And I think that if we don't take to the measure mix into account, where it like really risks some inefficient. My examples were terrible there. I apologize, and probably more confusing, but the point really is that we could have some inefficient outcomes if we just translate the current fuel use to life cycle emissions. That's gonna send the market one signal, and then when you have cost implications and requirements of the act to do certain measures, that's going to send the market a different signal. And we need to, in setting the requirements, understand what kind of signal we want to send to the market.
Yeah, it's yeah, really hard to wrap the head around, but it also seems to me that basing it off of just a measurement, that's also a pretty big market intervention or, perspective, kind of structuring it in a way that's very based around a set measure mix. But sorry, I'm not explaining that really well, probably.
No,
need for the
there's
apology
risk. You don't
here.
want to. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Michelle.
No, I was simply saying, feel free to express yourselves. So not necessary to apologize for things that we're thinking out loud here. So I just want to encourage you there too.
Yeah, thank you. As you will see, when I think out loud, I'm not afraid to change my position on something, like a proposal.
Well,
But so I think you're right, though, Haley, that there's a risk of like we come up with this optimized measure mix, and we then are directing the market or picking winners, basically, because we're saying, here's the measure mix. We're basing the obligation by default. We're kind of picking a winner. I think of it more kind of like how we do a program potential study for Efficiency Vermont, right? And so we have like a measure mix that's assumed, but that's not the actual measure mix that Efficiency Vermont's required to install. They can have the flexibility to do things more efficiently. And so really for this first time around, we want to kind of set that program potential, like this kind of what might be optimized under the assumptions that are used for the potential study, but then the fuel providers based on that will then have some leeway to say, well, this is the most efficient way to get and meet our requirements.
What, setting aside the reconciliation issues for a minute, because I know I want to go there next, but just I've also had a hard time understanding the value of this potential study measure mix step. So maybe can I just give like an alternative example, and that might, in hopes that that might help. So it seems like the alternative way you could do this would just be to be like, okay, well, we need, I'll just make simple numbers. We need like 200 tons of greenhouse gas reduction, and there are 100 obligated entities, and this one, based on their proportion, is assigned 20 tons of greenhouse gas reduction. This one is assigned 2. Like, what is the problem with a like 1 clean heat credit equals 1 ton or 1 unit of GHG reduction process? Like, why don't you just give that, one of them gets 20 credits, one of them gets 2, and it totally is proportional to the amount of reduction they need to achieve?
I think it's because all the clean heat you would need to assign I think it's because if you're just saying you need this many emissions reductions, you need this many GWSA emissions reductions, right? And that might not be the same number of clean heat credit emissions reductions. So the clean heat credit is a life cycle number, and so each measure has a different value than what it might have for inventory reductions.
So it's purely because of that translation that they're measured on 2 different accounting methods, that it can't be like the simple.
I think so, yeah.
I'd agree, and I'm listening to this conversation, and I'm wondering if before our next meeting, it would be useful to come up with a rubric, might not be the correct word, but for a summary table to point out, to illustrate and have in a single place for us, to recognize the translation and the information that's going in. Some of it's the same going into the 2 different sets of calculations, and just summarizing it again for us in a single place for reference. Would that be useful for other people as well? Or is that jumping ahead with the process that we're trying to come up with anyway? I'm sorry, go ahead.
I think it would be. I don't know if it could be done by like clean heat measures. I guess if we could circle back to that in a second, Michelle, I think that could be a good idea. But I wanted to, when Haley suggested, like, I think the next thing we should work on is translating the overall emission targets into credits. To me, that seemed to skip you know, A, maybe we don't quite have the pieces in place to do that because we're waiting for the potential study, but there's all of these reconciliation issues.
Well,
So
exactly, and I'm just thinking of
so
laying that out the way we're throwing them around right now.
to sort of, so we need to recommend, I think part of our task is to recommend processes to address those various reconciliation issues. So I think, I'm not sure I would do it by measure. I'd have to think about that more, but like, we could identify, I think, the set of issues like at prior meetings and in the meeting with Colin. We know there's a reconciliation issue with biomass, for example. We know there's a reconciliation with in-boundary emissions versus upstream and life cycle emissions. We know there's a reconciliation with how electricity emissions are counted because they're like not in the thermal sector of the inventory. So there's 3 issues right there that seem pretty clear that like, we kind of need to.
And exactly, so to simply lay those out. That makes sense.
And I think for the in-boundary piece also probably relates to that'll relate to the GREET discussion that we're hoping to have at our next TAG meeting, because a lot of those boundary issues are going to relate to renewable fuel measures. Like we're not going to have as many, I think, in-boundary issues for something like weatherization. It's going to be a lot of like, where are the feedstocks coming from? And I think so. Yeah. So I think if we could sort of like, I'm not sure how to facilitate a process to do this, but if we could spend, maybe our next step is to just tackle those reconciliation challenges one by one and see if there's any places where we can arrive at a recommended process for translating from the clean heat life cycle analysis to the GHG inventory, I guess and is that our output? Like what process do we need to recommend? Is it a process Deirdre, maybe you've thought about that. Like if you could state that for me, that would be helpful.
Yeah, if you want, you go ahead, Deirdre. It's the same request that the commission has made.
Right, just the process from getting from the inventory to the clean heat credit, basically what Haley said, 10 or 15 minutes ago. And how do you get from the inventory to clean heat credits being distributed to obligated parties? So I think
that
is absolutely in there, from obviously inventory to life cycle. And then some of the more granular reconciliation issues, like that they're in different sectors, might be, like electricity or wood, or that can be, I think that's important too. I just don't see that as high level as just getting from inventory, limits to the process from getting from inventory to credits.
Yeah, and but just the order that we needed is like inventory to credits, not credit to inventory. So that's helpful. Yeah, I'm just trying to think through how one would facilitate that process. Like I was hoping, because we kind of ran out of time with Colin, we sort of flagged those issues, but we didn't resolve them. I think it could be helpful to have, we want to make sure we understand how the inventory is actually doing certain things. So we know and so we understand how that might differ from the clean heat standard requires. So anyway, I think it might be helpful to have Colin there, but I'm just trying to think through like a sequence of events that would accomplish this.
Well, I think I like where you're going with this, Emily. I agree. We need to lay out the process, and this would be adding more detail to the straw proposal that TJ has referenced. The original department straw proposal talks about this as a bullet, and we've got the discussion today is revealing how many nuances there are in there, what sort of recommendations or assumptions are necessary for us to get to point from here to some process recommendations for the commission. And while we wait for the numbers, from what I understand, there could potentially, Emily, be almost a circular process if we're not careful with, because Colin made the comment, well, they're looking to rely on the new processes that we're coming up with for the clean heat standard and seeing how that we're going to continue to have both sets of numbers have them reconcile and match up. So I personally don't think we need to get too much into the weeds of what Colin's doing at the moment or as he's doing. That's going to evolve as our processes also evolve. But to be clear in how we're doing it and explaining how we're coming up with the numbers. So I would like to, and I don't know if we brainstorm it right now, I could share my screen and we could start laying out, you were stating some of the key concerns, Emily, at the beginning, the 3 things that we had to come up with. I can do it on a shared screen, or I can keep track of it now and share it for the group to digest along with the report that TJ's group's going to put together. We've got 15 minutes. Does this group want to try to document what we've been discussing thus far to capture those ideas right now? Or is that a step that's not needed?
Well, it would be good if you could restate what the like you just mentioned like several reconciliations that you thought were necessary, Emily, and if you could restate or summarize those, that'd be helpful for me. And whether we do it on a whiteboard or whatever, it doesn't matter to me.
Yeah, I mean, maybe that's a first step, or just highlighting the reconciliation issues and maybe in order of priority and identifying, do we actually have the information needed to recommend a process, or if not, what information do we need?
Exactly, that would be great.
Yeah, so number 1 is boundaries, the in-state boundary versus the upstream approach for the clean heat standard. And then I guess, do you want me to, I'll just list the ones I mentioned. Number 2 was
Yes.
biomass, treatment of biomass. And then number 3 was electricity generation, where that's counted. Deirdre said she was less concerned about the other 2 because they're just they're not not in the inventory, but rather are showing up in different parts of the inventory. But I don't know if other people share that view. It still seems like we could have a significant issue, because if the part of the inventory we're supposed to pay attention to is the thermal sector and parts of these aren't counted, then that does seem like something we're going to need to think through.
Yeah, so I think that those are the first 2, well, they all are actually just issues of how you count life cycle emissions. And then there's just one total reconciliation. So those are all 3 components, it seems like, of how we're going to create a clean heat credit value that's based on life cycle, life cycle, including upstream emissions reductions. And then it's like, once we have that, then there's the reconciliation of that number that's applied to, a measure to create a clean heat credit, and then what that credit is actually worth as it relates to the inventory. And those are that latter one, I think, is the important one for this group to tackle. The former one, I think, is happening through opinion dynamics and NV5 and the bioenergy group. In the case of biomass, you're actually coming up with a specific number. So I guess I'm not, I feel like the bigger reconciliation one is like once we have that number of this measure is a life cycle measure, and then here's the amount of life cycle emissions we expected to reduce, and then here's the amount of GHG inventory emissions we expected to reduce. That's the how we translate those two things to create requirements is our job.
Yeah, I kind of see our process as having like using like placeholder language like conversion rate or whatever sort of each fuel or measure however it's worked out, that being separate, and then our process is just laying out how the steps taken, and not having to dig into uh what that conversion or reconciliation is needs to be.
So I don't want to intervene too much. I want to like let this group kind of work through the issues, but I was wondering if it might be helpful if because it sounds like the next step there was, you know, people need to spend more time with like the measure mix idea and maybe the more time with like this translating, you know, emission levels into life cycle at that stage instead. So I was wondering if it makes sense to offline, you know, if TJ, maybe it would like, you could do like a plain language step-by-step of the potential study of how they're getting from emissions requirements to a measure mix and how that would be. Because I mean, I think the proposal does that at a high level, but maybe like that might help this group conceptualize that approach, you know, a little bit better. And then maybe Haley and someone else could think about doing it from the, you know, from the just emission, you know, from the inventory to a life cycle, whether that's like an emission factor based on, because that's where to be honest, that's where my brain goes to, is having each fuel type have kind of an emissions factor and having, you know, an inventory based trajectory and a life cycle based trajectory. So I don't know if that helps at all or if that complicates things, but that I feel like is kind of a next decision that maybe the group could help arrive at the next process piece.
Yeah, I think so. And the way you explained that made a lot of sense to me. As I understand it, NV5 hasn't proposed their methodology from going from GWSA to life cycle yet. We're hoping it's added to their methodology documentation soon. So I don't know if I can commit to, you know, next week for that one.
Yeah.
But what we may be able to do is provide kind of a table with an example of fake numbers of like why it's important to just for discussion purposes. This wouldn't be anything that ultimately gets into a process of why we think a measure mix is important. Trying to get to what I was explaining terribly earlier, but it could be just helpful to illustrate the issue.
Yeah, what Deirdre just said was really helpful to me, like having a life cycle based trajectory. So you could, if we could figure out the LCA methods that we want to use, we could apply them to the fuels in Vermont, you know, even if they're not counted that way in the inventory, and we could calculate what the emissions would be if calculated in using this other method, and then we could see how that trajectory compares to the one that we are actually tasked with meeting. And I think that exercise would be quite illuminating.
Okay, so all of you, I'm looking at the time, all of you are explaining far more clearly where I was trying to take us with a table to summarize, with some outlining it as it's been explained clearly here. So it sounds like TJ has taken on part of that. I'd like to take on part of that. Haley, does what Deirdre proposed for you, would that be something you could do? I'm wondering if we can, as a group, continue this discussion as TJ proposed by email to keep things moving along, if that's, yeah. So that we can come up with that table for next, at least outline that structure of a table for next week's meeting.
Yeah, my takeaway was sort of, well, my mind went to sort of framework for process, how I was envisioning it. If that, does that align with your table idea? Like if it
Yes,
was sort of, okay,
yes.
then yeah, sort of just, I don't even know if I could really use example numbers, but just sort of, yeah,
It may be thinking
process
of
steps
it
basically.
like a flow chart. It may be thinking of
Mhm.
it as a step-by-step table. It might be bullets. I think we've got half dozen people on here, at least, who are speaking half a dozen different ways that our brains work to process this information. So Deirdre very concisely summarized things. A lot of good information's been coming out. I think that putting it more into some sort of a table or process summary for us to see the interrelationships, understand which are critical, which must happen. As Emily pointed out, there could be, or as several of you did, there might be multiple valid steps to get to the requirements that are listed in the statute. So this is a time for us to revisit all of that and summarize the progress we've made, what we're waiting for from various other groups working here to support the tag, and what we, as this subgroup, uh, would like to move with next week and the week after, and the week after that. I'm not going to count down the 6 meetings until statute, until we got specific requirements. I'm seeing nods. So TJ, rough timeline for those numbers you were initially proposing? I'm sensing that shouldn't be something that's a maybe for next Thursday, so not something we pin our next step to.
Yeah, so the first part of the the process, just to set the GWSA trajectory, I think hopefully by like Tuesday of next week, we will have something out to you so that we could also um have time to talk about it, or time to digest it before talking about it. The other table, I'm not sure. We'll aim for that time frame and see what we can do. Not sure if it'll happen right then. And I'll say,
Fair.
Matthew is on the line here for the PSD, and he's going to be taking the first shot at a lot of this. So, if Matthew, if the timeline for Tuesday is not doable, then at least for that first one, then should probably speak up. But I think that's probably
Tuesday should be fine for that first part. I'm not sure how long it'll take me to try and do draft reconciliations from GWSA to life cycle. So I don't know how big that question is yet, because I'm going to have to look at the inventory methodology document pretty closely, and then probably also look into the sources that the inventory is using as well.
So yeah, and I don't think we want numbers yet. It just more like the structural process. And I just want to say that out loud. See nodding. So
Yes.
so but understanding that it will, in order to get that process, you need to understand some of those numerical methodologies. So that was about as caveat-y of an answer as I could give you.
That's fair. That's fair. This group's preference, breakout session next Thursday with a short report out to the full tag, or keep it as a full breakout. I don't feel like we need 45. I don't feel that we're prepared for 45 minutes to share with tag yet.
No, I think we mainly just need another session, breakout session. And this is still in flux, but there's a chance that Colin might be at the meeting with the consultants that worked on the ANR upstream analysis report, in which case possibly he could join us to discuss some of these like to sort of, that seems to me like a useful exercise to just more clearly identify the what we know and what we don't know about these various reconciliation issues. So we could see if he might be available to join. So I don't personally think there's really, I think you gave a good update at our last check-in, Michelle, of where we are, and we don't really have anything significantly different that we're ready to report back. I think by the next meeting after that, the 13th of June, I think we should be ready to at least propose the trajectory method, which I think TJ did a good job summarizing today.
Excellent. Any other thoughts or comments to share as we come to the close of our hour?
I can try to have the structure I talked about filling out ready for the Thursday meeting next week for us, breakout session.
Excellent.
Um,
Excellent.
But I don't know if I'll have it ready to circulate before. I'll try.
Fair enough. And same thing for the list table rubric, whatever I want to define it as. I'll be doing the same thing to target for Thursday. Sooner if I happen to have it. All right.
Just to mention, I will, I'm gonna miss the next tag meeting, so I unfortunately will miss the breakout session and the full group, but and then just as a procedural thing, if one of you, probably Michelle, if you could record at the next subgroup or at the breakout session next Thursday, since I won't be there, that would be excellent.
Okay, I will do that. And Rick has appeared on screen. Thank you for joining us this morning.
Well, thank you. I frankly am beginning to worry about the number of people who are not going to be able to make the next tag meeting. Catherine, I'll chat with you later about that. There are a number of others who won't be able to make it either. So I want to think about whether there's a scheduling question. But for now, let's move on. Thank you very much for all that you're doing. This is terrific.
Thank you.